Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this Folk Unlocked panel. My name is Angus Finnan, and I'm honored to serve our community as the Executive Director of Folk Alliance International. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I acknowledge my privilege as an able-bodied, neuronormative, English-speaking, educated, heterosexual, white male in an institutional position of power. Before we begin today, let's take a moment to acknowledge that we are joined by folks from various locations using technology that is not accessible to all. I join you today from Kansas City on the traditional indigenous land of the Osage, Kansa, Kickapoo, and Oceti-Sakowin nations. We honor with gratitude their elders, past, present, and future. We recognize the importance, complexity, and difficulty of land acknowledgements in the context of online organizing, creation, and collaboration. If you'd like to share a land acknowledgement, please do so in the chat. Today's conversation is central to the stated mission, vision, and values of our organization. The continuous personal and professional work of anti-racism is more than any one panel can address. It's more than any one training session at an event. We must undertake more than just a program theme, however deep it goes. And this is challenging, lifelong work and part of a critical element for our own community's journey to better understand how, despite best intentions, our own genre and industry has been complicit in the perpetuation of dominant culture norms, definitions, and control. We invite you to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to use this time together well, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and accomplishment. To host today's session, I would like to introduce Karima Dowdy. Karima is an arts and culture producer with a focus on community curation and popular education centered on social justice, racial equity, and global citizenship. She is a Fulbright scholar, was a longtime employee of the Old Town School of Folk Music in Chicago. She's a member of WOCA, Women of Color in the Arts, and she currently serves as Public Programs and Special Events Coordinator at the Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design in Honolulu, Hawaii. Finally, I'm honored to share that Karima will be leading FAI's Cultural Equity Council, along with her co-convener Dom Flemings, when the Community Engagement Council launches this year. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome, Karima.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so very happy to be here, zooming in from Honolulu in the occupied Kingdom of Hawaii. We're going to begin this discussion under the assumption that those of you watching have already realized and publicly acknowledged that you have work to do dismantling the structures of systemic oppressions and injustices within your organization, your community, and yourself. You can see how the systems in place are untenable, how much change needs to happen to create and foster an environment that provides equitable access across all intersections of identity. You see how important it is to shift the narrative and build new structures within your community, your audience, your staff, your stakeholders, your artists, whatever your case may be. This discussion starts from there, not on how to begin imagining, but how to move from imaginings into action, overcoming obstacles, participating actively in the creation of a new vision for a truly inclusive cultural sector and world. And should you feel that you're just coming to that work, that's okay too. There's no shame in this. It's messy work. It takes lots of time and lots of energy, and it's never too late to start. We welcome you. I'm going to shift now and go over today's agenda. We have some remarkable panelists joining us from all around the world, and I can't wait to dig in with all of them. We'll start by talking about our commitments to each other, to working in integrity, and to the long game. Next, we'll dive into the work we have to do and the approaches that are being taken. And then we'll discuss the roadblocks and challenges to the work, and finally, what we envision for the road ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our first section, integrity, commitment, and the long game, in addition to our introductions with our wonderful panelists. So as I introduce each of you, I'm going to also ask a question. And if you could provide a little response in addition to some information about the organization that you work with and the work that you do, that would be wonderful. So, as organizations, how does one get beyond the performative or something that's just for show to create true change in regards to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in all realms of our sector? We're going to go ahead and start the introductions, and then I'll give a little brief intro for each of you. And then if you could answer that question, that would be wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and start with our esteemed panelist, Felicia Butterfield Jones. Felicia Butterfield Jones is Chief Diversity Officer for the Recording Academy. She was Global Head of Inclusion at Google and was the National Youth Vote Director for the Obama campaign. Welcome, Felicia. Could you introduce yourself and explain to us how we get beyond the performative?
Sure, Karima. I first just want to say thank you to Folk Alliance International for hosting this important conversation, especially with the focus on action. And so it is just an honor to be here with you all today. Again, my name is Felicia. I serve as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Recording Academy, so home of the Grammys, home of Music Cares and the Grammy Museum and the Latin Grammys. And we are a 63-year-old organization that is very committed to this next chapter. I was appointed into the role last year. And I really will say that I think the key to moving past performative action to real tangible action and outcomes really boils down to accountability. As we think of the commitment that each of our organizations are making, we've seen across music, across genres, increased and heightened awareness around DEI and a focus and real commitment. As an example, the three major labels, Universal, Sony, and Warner, have now appointed Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officers in each of those organizations. But we can't stop there. As much as I appreciate being the first to serve in this role at the Recording Academy, I know that I'm only going to be measured by the impact that we make together. And so, again, accountability, I really think, Karima, is the what and how we really move the needle, and excited to explore in this conversation the tangible steps to get there.
Thank you so much. Accountability, we'll definitely come back to that soon. I'm super excited to dig more into that. So next, our next esteemed panelist is Laura Camacho Salgado. And Laura is the International Festival Coordinator at Oslo World and is co-creator of Map the World and the Utopian Manifesto. Welcome, Laura. Please introduce yourself, and same question to you.
Hello, do you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you, Laura.
Thank you, sorry. So my name is Laura, and thank you for having me. Thanks, Folk Alliance, to put this platform for us to talk and share. I'm Colombian, born in Colombia, but I have been living in Europe for the last decade. The last 5 years, I've been living in Norway, where I have been working in Oslo World. And we're talking about how we talk about diversity, equity, and what is really important for us in Oslo World is the mix between awareness, the dynamic of unlearning, and the importance of organizing and join together. And because of that, we have created the Utopian Manifesto. And today we are going to talk more about that. But it's how you say, between this intention that we're having and then the action. In these topics, we have to walk together. And the Utopian Manifesto started in 2019, in which, after a lot of talks and a lot of panels about gender equality, anti-racism, anti-discrimination, more and more we're joining with different organizations, small and big festivals, in which we're trying to find a change, but there is little time for a lot of people. And that's why we have to work together, both because it has to be an effort that we have to talk in a more global matter, but also because we have to join a more or a less Eurocentric and Anglophone perspective to that change. So for now, we are working with 20 different organizations and over 100 people that have been participated. But also we're talking in this project in different languages, from Japanese to English, from Norwegian to Spanish, from French to Arabic. Because in order to have the change, then we have to rethink how we start this change. So that's um, our one of the examples that we're talking about this action. And another part is how we use our platforms. Oslo World is a festival that has been created in the 94 in Norway, in a moment that migration it was new to Norway, and from the beginning, our role as a festival is to bring different voices to a music festival. And from there, we have been always fitting the context that there's around our festival. So we have started using our platform, both, for example, for gender equality. So we have joined Key Change to achieve 50-50 gender equality. And on top of that, we have been creating, for example, other festivals like Nabolag, our neighborhood, that we have started in 2014. It's a festival that we created to do in different asylum seeker centers across Norway to trigger the dialogue between the newcomer refugees in Norway and the neighborhood around them. So, for example, there are some small examples of our different projects, but it's a way for me to show a little bit the importance for us in the festival to talk and have a dialogue between us and the context. So thank you, Karima, for having me here.
Thank you so much, and can't wait to dive into some of those examples a little bit later on in the conversation. Next, we're going to introduce another one of our wonderful panelists, Courtney Toney, who is the co-founder of Nashville Music Equality and president of Women's Music Business Association. Welcome, Courtney. Same question to you. How do we go beyond the performative? How do we make true changes that are not just for show?
Yes. First and foremost, thank you again as well for welcoming me to this wonderful conversation. I'm honored to be here. I will have to echo the sentiments of our statements from the previous panelists, and especially with Felicia's comment. I think it is holding people's feet to the fire. I think that we cannot allow these times to be a portion where it's like we're checking a box. That just cannot be what this moment is. And we also need to hold people who are especially non-minorities, whether it's gender, race, economics, whatever it may be, to be opening up doors and creating those opportunities for minorities to be able to come into. And also speaking up in those rooms. I find that a lot of the conversations I've had, especially over this past year, I've had a lot of people, specifically whites, ask me, what can they do more? And I always tell them that you guys are in a lot of those spaces that I, along with many of my other minority colleagues, would love to be in, but those doors seem to be closed on us. And so I encourage and push them to go into those rooms and advocate for us and speak up for having us at the table, and also, allowing us to be into the space, because I think that a lot of times also there are events and opportunities that are happening, and sometimes they miss the mark. And I think that sometimes if we had people of color or people, women and, just all backgrounds at those tables, sometimes those marks don't have to be missed. So that's definitely something that I would recommend.
Thank you so much. You know, something you just said made me think of a comment that a colleague of mine said once, which was, you know, there was a meeting, a staff meeting, and there was some sort of racial undertones in the staff meeting towards this Black colleague of mine. And afterwards, another white colleague said, "I'm so sorry that happened." And my Black colleagues said, "Well, I don't need your apology afterwards. Where were you in the room when it was happening? Why didn't you speak up?" You know, and so having access to those rooms and those spaces and saying something in the moment is definitely a theme that I've personally heard many times. So thank you so much for sharing that part, Courtney. Really appreciate that. So we're going to keep going. Still some wonderful additions to our panel. Next, we have Alison Authit, who's the founder of Alliance for Equity in the Music Industry, and may be familiar to our members from her previous work at Six Shooter Records and Factor in Canada. Alison, thank you so much for being here. Same question to you. How do we go on beyond the performative, and also tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for having me here with these unbelievable heavy hitters. And I'm super excited because I think one of the things that will help us move the conversation forward is being able to build a community of practice, including all of you. Now we can be in touch. Now I can be in touch with you. Sorry, I'm just trying to deal with this sunbeam. I hope it's not distracting. But yeah, no. So I'm based in Canada, and in Canada we have a particularly interesting situation because we have an awful lot of government funding that goes into the music industry, and that's largely where I'm focused with the Alliance for Equity in the Music Industry, because the impact, or one of the impacts of having all of that funding available for the music industry, is that it completely distorts the value proposition, and that's one of the things that I'm focused on. But specifically in terms of, you know, how to move the conversation forward, I think for me, it's accountability is a huge piece, but also I think making sure that people understand what the conversation is about, because I think often they don't. I think that, you know, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, if you were talking about diversity in the music industry, certainly in Canada anyway, it ended up being, well, what we need is more white ladies on boards of directors. And, you know, that's not it. And now we talk about equity and inclusion. And, you know, I'll often hear organizations talk about, well, we want to do these things to be more inclusive. And I think that suggests a kind of fundamental misunderstanding about, for me, what the task ahead is, which is, you know, it's not about trying to find ways to shoehorn people into structures and systems that weren't made for them, that weren't made for their interests and their talents and their ideas and their dreams. They were made for a very small, privileged group of people. So it's not about shoehorning everybody into these structures that weren't made for them, but finding ways to either build new and different structures together, or certainly in the case of Canada, it's about you know, organizations like mine and people like me using our privilege and our knowledge and our influence to hold space for other groups to come in and do what they want based on what their needs are and according to, you know, their purposes. And that may or may not have anything to do with me. That's up to them. So yeah, that's what I think. It's really, really important that we understand what the meanings of the terms are. What does inclusion mean? What does equity mean? And in my work with, you know, Canadian music organizations, I find that they don't really necessarily get it. They think, oh, let's get one of everybody at the table and problem solved. That's not it.
Excellent. Yeah, it's something we're going to dig into a bit more later. Is systems change, structural change. Who was this made for? And it's so important to dig into that and really speak truth to those facts. Thank you so much, Alison. We now have Lina Nahlus. who is the Executive Director of Diversity Arts Australia and the host of the Color Cycle podcast. Welcome, Lena. So happy to have you here. We're really bridging the whole world in this discussion today. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your thoughts on how we get beyond the performative.
Thank you, Karima, and thanks for the previous panelists. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wangal of the Eora Nation in Sydney, in Australia, and to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and to extend that respect to all First Peoples joining us from across Australia and the world. Thank you for this opportunity to have this discussion, and that the panel have already kind of covered some of the most important things about how you go beyond being performative in the way that you do create true change. And I think that we need, I would encourage people to really invest in doing the work and commit to doing the work of racial equity, and that takes time. And in terms of an organization or a company, that's about kind of ongoing learning and education and training, and as Laura said, unlearning as part of that, and tie that kind of education and training to the systems and the structures of your organization, and interrogate those structures, and and undo a lot of them and create other structures that are going to be kind of inclusive, or that are designed from and with the communities who are truly representative of the world that we're in, so that are representative of culturally diverse people and people of colour. We use a lot of different terminology in Australia, and some of the terminology that's used in North America as well. And but we also at Diversity Arts Australia have a strong focus on people from ethnocultural migrant backgrounds and people from refugee backgrounds as well. So if we're going to, and according to our data here, 39% of the Australian population is culturally diverse, or from non-Anglo, non-white kind of culturally diverse backgrounds. And yet in the arts and creative sectors, there's a massive underrepresentation. And so when we interrogate that kind of those kinds of structures, then we also need to develop plans and strategies, equity action plans that are tied to kind of funding outcomes that work across the other, the other kind of plans within the company and organizations, and that can be measurable and actionable. So I guess one of the examples that we, and obviously like being, not just being performative is not just about having people, in front of the camera or on the stage, but it's also about having non-white people in decision-making positions, and making sure that's that's at kind of all level at all levels of the organization and of the work. I guess an example that I wanted to give of that is a website that we've been developing, and that's online now, called the Creative Equity Toolkit, that we've been developing with the British Council. And it's a really practical site of actions and strategies and resources. And I know that, there are many of these around the world, but it's also about, I guess, kind of us giving organizations and companies those resources in a kind of curated way. And I guess we're constantly being asked to give this advice and give this support, but at some stage, do the training, work with consultants, or and work with communities, but also you're going to need to, as a leader of an organization, do the work. So I think the question I was given was what advice we would give to others and in leadership roles, but I might have got that a little bit wrong. Sorry, was that a little bit too long?
No, that was perfect. And we will get to that question in a little while. I'm sure there's so much wisdom for everybody to impart. So one of the last things you just said, Lena, is talking about creating things with communities, not for. And I think that that's so interesting, and it kind of leads me into my next question. We're all coming from different countries and cultural contexts. Many of us are coming from white supremacist settler states, where the systems and structures were actually created for one group of people and not for others. And given the particular histories and ways of approaching racial healing, cultural equity, truth, reconciliation in our different contexts, how would you say that your organizations determine who to center in your work? And who are you committed to in this long game? How do you center those voices? And then sort of a follow-up question on that is, does that, that striving to center vulnerable voices also create tensions in other parts of your work? For example, donors, sponsors, reporting to grants, organizational members. How do you continue to consistently center the most vulnerable voices in your communities? Anyone want to jump in on that? It was a long question, but
I can start. For me, with National Music Equality, which is primarily where a lot of my diversity work is done, just to kind of give you guys some background, NME was started out of an absence that I personally felt. I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee, and on Blackout Tuesday, I ended up texting two of my friends in the industry, and I was just like, is there anything happening? There was, it just felt like to me there was an absence, and there was this great day that the show must be paused, but it felt like it was just like a day off. And that really concerned me. I really wanted there to be some kind of action behind the statement. And so with National Music Equality, we thankfully were able to form a panel that ended up getting over 1,000 of our music industry colleagues here in the community and beyond involved in our conversation. And from there, we ended up forming our organization. And I would say for us, as far as any difficulties or, weird spaces for us going into, it would be because we primarily talk about the country music industry, because the country music industry really does have not the best reputation when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And that has been a really strong key point for us to continue to talk about. As much as, I have great colleagues that are, in this industry, it has been, again, us holding their feet to the fire. And a lot of them have come out and have been very receptive to what we've been saying, and very thankful to kind of have a mirror held up to their faces and recognizing of certain things that they may not even, unwillingly know that they're guilty of, or just honestly, just not even recognize it. And so for us, it doesn't necessarily cause any tensions. I think more than anything with National Music Equality, it creates an open space, an open and safe dialogue for us all to discuss things, whether we're panelists or whether it's just our audience coming in to learn more about us. So definitely the country music industry is our focal point at this point, but we also know that there are issues in all genres of music, but right now that is something that, as far as our organization NME, that we're focused on.
Excellent. I think Valisha, you wanted to jump in as well?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in after Courtney, and thank you, Courtney, for the valuable information that you shared. And what I think we all know here is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is no longer a nice to have, but it truly is a business imperative for any organization or business to remain competitive. No matter how successful they may be today, DEI has to become a clear priority and focus in every organization. And so as we think about, how do we prioritize this work? How do we prioritize certain groups? For me, it always goes back to the data. understanding that there are systemic barriers in place that have marginalized different groups, but you really have to get granular in the data to understand your baseline. So thinking about race and gender and ethnicity and age and persons with disabilities, so accessibility being a key focus, LGBTQIA representation, and I can continue with underrepresented groups, but really understanding the rich data within each organization, because every one of us has different needs. So understanding the data intersectionally is a focus. And then also for us, creating definitions for DEI for every organization. One of the first things I did when I entered this role was to just reach consensus as an organization, not only with our staff, but also with our members and beyond, on what are the universal definitions that we have for DEI, right? So diversity meaning, having strong representation in the room, but equity, adding an additional layer to that to make sure that those voices are appreciated, embraced, and valued and prioritized. And then inclusion, making sure that there's an environment where all of those individuals can thrive and grow. And so as we think about DEI, my focus is always equitable outcomes for everyone. And if the goal is equitable outcomes for everyone, it's understanding the baseline and where are the opportunities. I don't even call them gaps anymore, challenges, but where are the opportunities? Because we know when we have more diverse voices in the room, our businesses thrive. We know that when we have more diversity in the room, music grows, right? And so thinking about how do we creatively, innovatively, and with our business, lens, make sure that we are ensuring that through the data and how we're analyzing that and setting clear goals.
Amazing. I think this is just super interesting, the data, really getting into the granular and understanding the historical reasons behind the in access to certain, to certain things in, like, whether that be housing, whether that be education, all of these things that can lead to this inequity that we see today in our own field, which the reasons behind that may have nothing to do with the field that we're currently working in, right? Arts and culture. So I'd love to keep going. I know that we have we have some perspectives from outside of the US, which is great. Lena, would you like to jump in there? I think you might be muted.
Muted. Yeah, that was a great point. Thank you. Yeah, so in Australia, we in the arts, in terms of leadership, for example, including the music industries, we don't have a lot of that baseline data. And what we've been doing over the last few years at Diversity Arts Australia is developing that, research and baseline data. And we did the first ever research into cultural and linguistically diverse, inclusive of people of colour, migrant, refugee communities, representation in leadership positions across 200 leading arts organisations in Australia, so nearly 2,000 leaders. And what we found was that in more than half of all organisations, there were no people of colour or culturally diverse people at any leadership position, not on a board, not as an executive, not on an award or judging panel. And in the music industry, it was 61% of organisations had no diversity in terms of cultural and linguistic or people of colour. I'm trying to make sure I use the North American terms at the same time as well. And so I do think that data is incredibly powerful, because for so long in my other roles in other companies, or we were constantly being told, and when I came into this role, well, you can't prove that. You can't prove that. Well, yes, we can prove that. And, and why is this the case? And as Karima said, it's kind of, it's understanding those systemic and kind of historical kind of, I guess, that kind of history for the existence of this, but it's also kind of being able to have that data so that we can develop kind of concrete actions and strategies to address it. And so we exist for the culturally diverse artists who make up nearly 40% of Australia's, people, and who are underrepresented across all the arts music screen industries in Australia. So we exist for them, and we support organisations and companies and government in their diversity objectives. But at the core of what we do, it's culturally diverse artists who we represent and who we exist for. And so that means that we've developed and restructured our company so that people from those backgrounds, and when I say artists, it's inclusive of people in leadership roles or managers, that it means that they're leading the work that we're doing, that they're the majority of people on our board, in our organisation, who are all of our trainers are trained to be who are from those communities who they represent. So if we're working in a particular area, then we only work with people from those we don't only work with people from those communities, but in terms of training, it's led by the communities who the training is focused on. So I think centering people in that way, and then there's a real integrity to it, and it's not kind of I guess that's all that I needed to say.
Excellent. I think it's so interesting too when you look at there's a big difference in approach. I feel like depending on if your organization was actually created for a particular ethnic community or racial community, or if it was what we say in the States, a PWI, a predominantly white institution that's now grappling with how to become more inclusive. And a lot of these things can pop up in both and all kinds of institutions in very different way. And sometimes the system of white supremacist hierarchical structure can appear in an organization that is run by and produced for people of color or culturally diverse people. And so that's a super interesting thing as well. And amazing to know that, you all are creating programming and trainings for the people, of the people. And that to me is another answering our first question, is much more than performative. It's not just, oh, we have this person on stage to perform for you. It's, no, we're working in this community. So that's a great example. I know we have one more, Laura wanted to add one more thing right before we move on to our next section, which will continue to dig into all of these wonderful conversations. So if you would like to jump on in, Laura, please do.
Thank you. And thank you, all of the speakers. It's amazing to hear you all. And I want to go back a little bit about the question that you said, Karima, because you asked if there are some tensions when talking about these topics in funding and sponsors. And then from the beginning of this panel, I feel like the only fact that work with these topics in some cases is also because we have the privilege to do so. As Alison said, in Canada, there is sponsors and funders for these kind of topics. Here in Norway as well, Oslo World is heavily state funded. So that's why we could work with this kind of topics, even though I agree, and I think we all agree, like Valeisha and Lina said, working with diversity and equity is profitable, and it's the data there is there to prove it, but people don't see it that way. And that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more in a bigger picture. For example, the fact that we're working with different organizations with the Utopia Manifesto, it always talks about this kind of privilege, because we're working, for example, with organizations like Favela Sounds in Brazil and Beirut Jam Sessions or Beirut and Beyond in Lebanon. And when we talk about these topics, it comes again to the point like how we talk about the topic when you're against this status quo, you're against the heavy funded governments that are against what you're doing it. For example, the case of Favela Sounds is really interesting. They're, as the name says, they're working about the music from the favelas with LGBTQI+, with Afro-Brazilians, with, in a way, everything that Bolsonaro is against. So that means that then you don't get the same funding. And it goes the same Colombia, and then and talking about this kind of topics in Colombia also, how you get this funding if you're a small festival or a small organization. is more complicated. So I think it's not it's just to put it out loud, and it's in our case as of the world, we have the privilege to get funds and then to doing work in these projects and to go towards this action. But then it is important to address also that in a lot of cases, the cultural sector, especially now with the COVID, is in a really unbalanced situation across the world. And it's not more about action, it's more about resilience. So I just wanted to acknowledge this part, because it's always really easy to get in our own context all the time. And it is important to, acknowledge this kind of challenges. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing about all of your wonderful experiences and thoughts about this sort of first general subject. I mean, there's so many questions to ask. This conversation could go on for hours and hours. And hopefully, we have created this community so we can continue to build together and with you all watching and dig deeper into all of this. But we're going to kind of switch to the next part of the agenda, which is the actual work. And we've talked about this a bit already, but what's the work? What are the approaches? How are we going to really dig into all of this? And I would like to start with the first question that was mentioned earlier on, but what is your all's advice to community leaders who are assessing their own organization's stage and understanding as they try to plan and lead? And I'll combine that with another question, which is sort of about how do you, in assessing this, sort of who is assessing it and who are you all holding yourselves accountable to, or who should an organization hold themselves accountable to in this assessment of where you're at and how to move forward? Anybody want to jump in for that?
So I'll jump on that.
Great.
So I think, interestingly, in Canada, the setting aside the private industry, most of the music industry organizations are, like a lot of them are, definitely what you'd call predominantly white institutions for sure. And I think the most important thing that those organizations can do, if they get it, if they decide they want to get on a path of developing equity culture inside their organizations and in the communities that they serve, the first and most important thing is to get educated on what that means and to develop that championship at the top as well as at the grassroots, so that they have a top-down and bottom-up approach at the same time. I think that there's a certain amount of, there's lots of talk, lots of organizations that want to talk about becoming, turning toward equity. And then, you have these old folks on the board, and they don't want to give up their board seats, and they don't want to give up their power, and they don't want to do those things. I think you have to square that away first. I think you really do have to have that championship at the level of your boards of directors and among your senior leadership before you get cracking. And then I strongly recommend that you engage with, a process, whether it's with a consultant or an equity, someone who can deliver an equity audit, so that you have a clear picture, and that's going to be data-based. You need to approach it like it's a strategic plan, because it is a strategic plan, because what you're trying to do is fundamentally change the nature of your operations and the impact that you have in the community that you're reaching and the people that you're engaging with. You need to think of it as being a very fundamental and significant sea change, and that requires planning and championship. So I would start there.
Excellent. Yeah, fundamental change, and being open to hearing that your organization needs fundamental change. That, I think, is the hard part as well. Anybody else have thoughts on and advice to other organizations on where to start? Looks like Lena, you'd like to maybe add something?
Just very quickly that following on is that after you do the audit, then tie it to the development of whatever you call it in your region of the world, an equity action plan that focuses on both organizational structures and practices, so that the actual audit is tied to a plan that looks at policies, leadership in the organization, recruitment, all of those areas, the structures and the practice.
Amazing. And so I want to kind of like add on to this. Some of what you're all talking about is bringing me to another question about budgeting. What does an anti-racist, culturally equitable budget look like? And it's just, at this point, we can't say that we can't afford to do certain things anymore. Something that really stuck out to me in my experience working in Chicago was organizing some arts classes on the South Side, which, if you say South Side of Chicago, in parentheses, that means the poor Black hood neighborhood, which has been disinvested in for many, 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 many years through racist policies. And I remember having somebody say to me, like, you all keep bringing us these art classes and that's cool, but year after year, you all have jobs and we're still poor, we're still going to jail, we still have violence. And like, I'm glad my kid can do some art classes here, but you're the ones who are full-time employed providing this to us. And so in budgeting, in true, equitable, sustainable, what does that look like, and how can we truly bring it from just wishful thinking to something that is a priority and is part of the long game? So that was a little bit of a ramble, but basically, how do you tie equity action plans and the things that your organizations are doing into a budget? How does it get baked in? It's not just a side dish, it's baked in. Any thoughts on that from you all?
I can jump in, Karima, just to kick us off, because it's such a good question. And I think for me, I've worked for, Fortune 5 companies and also nonprofit organizations. And I think it starts with exactly what Michelle said, first having a board level commitment. And that means for me, setting clear KPIs, key performance indicators, or OKRs, depending on the terminology using your organization. But just as you may have a sales KPI, or just as you may have an audience or viewership KPI goal for the year or for your 5-year strategic plan, also setting a DEI KPI. And so that's the first step for me. And that KPI and the accountability for this work should be held accountable, not only to, your chairman or CEO of your organization, but also the board. So for example, in my role, my work is held accountable to our board of trustees. And so another way to make sure that it's prioritized, once you have that accountability layer and goal in check, I think it really boils down to really understanding, okay, what do we want to accomplish? And so that equity audit is so key, because you don't want to under-resource what the actual scope of work may be. So as you do your equity audit, you're looking at things like pay equity analysis, level equity analysis. You're looking at things like retention in your organization, progression, upward mobility for underrepresented talent, hiring, and the list goes on. But once you have that audit and you understand, your baseline, where maybe some of the gaps, or what I call, instead of gaps, opportunities may be, you then resource appropriately. If that feels like way too much for the stage that you're in your organization, I would say I would start with 3 things. The first is exactly what Michelle just said around education, educating yourself and doing it fast, like commit to being on a learning journey this year. The second is representation matters. And so if you do not have BIPOC representation at your board or C-suite level, I would set a 1-year goal to do it and to make sure that you have strong representation there. And then the last step is to make sure that the underrepresented communities within your organizations are not taxed or tasked with the work, right? It is very labor intensive, and so often, because there's so much passion around DEI, you'll find underrepresented groups committing to creating employee resource groups in the organization, committing hours and hours of volunteer time to getting this work right outside of their core role and what they're being paid to do. And so you want to make sure that you avoid the instinct to allow underrepresented communities in your organizations to do all the work. It really is a partnership, and making sure that you're carrying this weight as leaders of your organization while you commit to the funds, budget, and resources required to scale it.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. That is real. The emotional labor of carrying this work on people of color, of people of culturally diverse. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting the Australian terminology for it. We're learning each other's lingo, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And so thank you so much for speaking to that. The sweat equity. Yes, Felicia. Anybody else want to jump in about this budgetary sort of question? If not, we'll, oh yes, okay, great, Laura.
Okay, so thank you, Valisha, for your insightful tips. When I saw this question about budget, how does the budget has to look like? And in a way, I wanted to say, well, the same like a normal budget, in a really easy answer, because just want to let you know just how we pay people. Usually when people start putting in their organization gender equality projects or minority communities projects, they tend to not pay them. And for example, it's a fact that in different platform or festivals, people don't pay the same. The male performers and the female performers, or so be sure that everyone has to be paid equally. And that comes with something that is really important when we're talking about diversity and equity, is about transparency. And this is something that we should talk about, how the fact that working with these subjects is well remunerated. How if you have a 50-50 gender equality in your board members, they're paid equally, or from different minorities. So that's something important. The staff in recruitment, how it's as equal as possible. So that is one part of the budget. Like, for example, in the case I'm a festival, so how we put 50-50 programming in the lineups and how it's paid accordingly, or the staff or the board members for one side. So in a way, you have to work with that budget. In the other way, if you want to change from audience, that sometimes is important to look for funding and different investments. For example, one point that we have discussed in the Utopian Manifesto is the fact that we have to decentralize the culture. So, for example, go through different venues, different areas of the city, work, for example, in the accessibility for venues. All of that, it could be an investment from the beginning. And some venues, small venues, they could not afford that. So that is something that we have to start talking about funding. And in countries that there is less funding, sometimes it's a challenge. But as culture should be accessible to all, it's important to remember there's like a fundamental right in the Bill of Human Rights. So I think it's both. It's which kind, like in advice, is how you work through the budget. So it's as fair as possible when you do these changes in your organization, and not like an add-on that you just pay with air. So that's my perspective.
Amazing. Oh, okay, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. I feel like if, as an organization, if you can afford to cater your board meetings, you can probably afford to pay somebody to do some equity consulting, some equity work. It's a matter of priorities.
100%. Yeah, it is. And then it's, I guess the question in this is sort of going back to what Felicia was talking about, is getting the the board on board, getting the people, bringing the education to that level so that it's not just constantly fighting back against folks who just don't quite get it, or getting the leftovers or the crumbs to do these projects, but understanding that it is essential in moving forward our institutions. So I'm going to switch it a little bit into some of the roadblocks and challenges. We know there's plenty of them. We've already talked about a lot of them. And I'd really love to hear from you all if you've seen any roadblocks and challenges. How do you view systemic issues, particularly in music organizations? One thing, just to start it off, that I find a lot is just this the pace of everything, the rushing, that there's never enough time to truly build these relationships. There's never enough time, or there's never enough foresight to commit to something 10 years ahead, because we're just so especially in booking things and festivals and all of that, there's just this pace that is just, you feel like you're always playing catch up. So what do you all think? Do you have some roadblocks, challenges that you'd like to share, and possible solutions if you have any? But if you don't, that's fine too. We only have a few minutes for this one, so please, I'd love to hear from you. Please, Allison. Yeah.
No, I think Courtney was going to speak. So
sorry, I saw a little hand. Please, Courtney.
Yeah, I was just going to say very briefly, I think that one of the things is that organizations have to not be afraid to have people of diverse backgrounds be their leaders. I think that that organizations just need to get to a point where, and I understand, there's, a little bit of hesitancy at times, but I think that if we can get to the point where organizations are not afraid of having different events and opportunities where people that don't just look like them are at those places and on the stages and, headlining different, things that they're doing and conversations. I think that in itself is a big step of just not being afraid of, stepping out there and being a change maker.
Yes, not being afraid, bravery in all spaces. We have to. Too many people have had to be brave for too many years by force. So it's on us now. Any other thoughts about that? Sure, Laura.
I agree with you, Karima, in the fact that also the time is one of the biggest challenges. Time and funding. Time, because as you said, music industry is, everyone is kind of in a limit, in the edge. So people, they sometimes don't take the time to book differently, don't take the time to change and take the time of educate. And we're talking a lot about awareness and a lot about unlearning, but especially unlearning takes a lot of time. So then, as a way that we have been working is how we provide more easy data or more easy database of artists, for example, from the different female artists or minorities, so people would be able to see them more. That is one of the challenge. And the other challenge is one of the biggest challenge, our enemy of diversity sometimes is what called like high quality music or this kind of cultural canon. And that has been a blockage for a lot of times, at least in music business, because who is creating this canon? Who is saying what is high quality? And that is this idea again to come back to how we could decolonize this canon and how we could shift it. But it goes again to the point of how much people have time to rethink themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is tough work. It's trying to decolonize, it's trying to build equity, it's trying to build anti-racist structures inside of an inherently flawed system. And the systems are a bit different in all of our different contexts of where we live and where we work. But it's definitely, it's not easy because we're doing this work while also butting up against the structures themselves, right? So yeah, so much to talk about. There's we could have a whole other panel about this. We're gonna keep going to sort of your final thoughts about the road ahead. We know we have a lot of work to do. We've spoken to that throughout this panel. What is the road ahead? What is your hope for the future? What are your final thoughts? And, how can we also transform our sort of system, especially too in the music industry, where this sort of exclusivity and access to power is kind of wrapped up in everything. So how do we get around that and moving forward in the future? And what are some of your final thoughts about that? Sorry, I'm trying to combine questions to get to talk to everything, but, I'd love to hear your hopes for the future, your manifestations for what we're going to do. Who would like to jump in?
I can jump in.
Please.
I'm so excited about the future. And I mean it. I know the work that we do is really hard, deeply systemic, but none of it feels like a challenge to me or a barrier, honestly, although I know that's what it's designed in many cases to do, but it really just feels like just an open lane of opportunity. And for me, what I'm hopeful for is one, this conversation, coming together, listening, learning from each other. It has super, super inspired me and hopefully everyone watching. Partnership, right? Where do we go from today, right? How do we lock arms and really build for the future together? And then we used to always say this term in the tech world, but ask yourself, is it a bug or a feature? If it's a bug, let's fix it now, right? There are small adjustments that we can make in each of our organizations that don't require budget. What is the tone that we want to have in our organization? What is the language that we're going to use? What are, the things that we hold ourselves accountable to? What are those core values? Those are things we can do now while we work to disrupt or even dismantle those systems that may actually be a feature that we need to unpack and resource and unwind. And so I'm just so inspired because I know that the future is bright because of each of you. Even having this conversation, I know the work is in great hands. And so just really excited to see what comes out of this conversation.
Jump on in. I'm going to just, talk to each other, dialogue. It's not, please make yourselves at home in this Zoom room.
I just wrote down, is it a bug or a feature? Thank you so much for that. I am totally going to use that all over the place. And I will trade you for something that I learned today, which I think was, it's maybe a little bit off topic, but I read it's not off topic. It's totally on topic. I read there was an op-ed in the newspaper here in Toronto from a woman named Rosemary Campbell Stevens. And she was talking about how we use language when we talk about racial equity and stuff. And she said, so one of the terms that we like to use in Canada is visible minorities. But as a country, that's kind of not really who we are, and we are every day, the literal face of the country is changing. And she's recommending that we get rid of that terminology and instead we talk about the global majority. And that just hit me like a thunderbolt, the global majority. And so I'm going to embrace that language, that we're not talking about minority, this or that, or visible minorities. We're talking about the global majority. And I'm going to use that. And is it a bug or a feature? I love that as we go forward. But the other thing that I'm super grateful for is just, and I said this at the beginning of the conversation, I think it's really important that we be able to reach out to each other and explore best practice, explore what works and doesn't work. Because, I started kind of randomly doing this work maybe 10 years ago, and I made a lot of mistakes. It would have been awesome to have some people to reach out to and say, why didn't this thing work? So with your permission, I'd like to keep in touch.
You have my permission.
I wanted to echo both of you. I feel like just the fact of being in this room with you, it's such inspiring, and how we realized that all of us were doing kind of the same job, each of us in our own different context, and it's so insightful to start connecting. And with that is the hope about how we could go forward. I think this is the importance of, we have to work together, both because it's a global market, it's a global music market, but also because it's things that is happening in all around the world. So if we're addressing the time limit, also if we work together, it's going to be faster, or we're going to share more. So I think, like Alison said, and Valeisha, we have to continue, this conversation in different platforms, and still building a new, borderless platform for this kind of topics.
I'm happy to jump in if no one else is. I'm also kind of feeling very energized by this conversation and would really like to keep connected. I think that building solidarity across countries, but also within countries. We're working on a big project at the moment with the disability and First Nations communities, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done in Australia of developing the solidarity and connections, the intersectional work. So I think that we need that for our souls and to sustain the work that we do, because it is so incredibly exhausting and it takes so much from us, because it's not just a day job. And I think that, a future where we continue to have these conversations in nuanced, thoughtful ways that are really, we're constantly kind of reflecting, because the reality in which we live is always changing. And sometimes people say, oh, a future where we don't have to have these conversations. But no, diversity is something that is a real important kind of positive aspect of our world. And we don't want to kind of become monocultural. We want to always be having these kinds of conversations and supporting kind of difference and diversity for the music sector, because we've been working quite a bit over the last few years with the music, with both the not-for-profit and the business end of the music sector, a sector that kind of has a broader recognition and understanding of what music is. So very much kind of echoing what Laura said, the kind of, there's a dominance of a particular kind of American and white Australian, say, kind of music forms or particular kinds of music forms, and it really locks out, the potential for that. Yeah, like in Australia, we've got such diverse kind of culturally diverse musicians, and some of the interesting, we've got so many interesting examples of like world famous musicians who migrate to Australia as refugees and kind of relegated to just world music, or the kind of the ethnic festival performance once a year. So there's a real need to kind of shift that and a broader understanding and kind of definition, and also more opportunities and recognition in the music industry for those underrepresented communities, or those global majority communities, and for First Peoples and people of color and other marginalized group, so that because I know this becomes a cliche, but music is, it's telling our stories, it's telling, it's kind of telling our aspirations, and so it needs to reflect and kind of all of those voices and aspirations and stories from our society, so that it's not further marginalizing communities. And finally, leadership is really important, I think, because leaders set the agendas. They act as gatekeepers, and they often, they're making a lot of those top level decisions about programming and employment. So I'd like to see more diverse leadership. And yeah, so very, very much kind of significant in an Australian context that's kind of, it's urgent. And that issue of trust that was already raised is a very is a very big one, and it's also along class lines, isn't it? It's not just race, it's classed and of course gendered. But in Australia, there's a lot more kind of, I guess, white women in our in leadership roles in our arts industries and film industries than there are certainly women of color or non-white people. Is that okay?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's more than okay. Courtney, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I just kind of want to speak on, I guess, just my hopes for the future. I personally love quotes and love history and love just, always just learning something new. And one of my favorite quotes is by Dr. King, and he said, "The time is always right to do what is right." And I think that more than anything right now, we are in that time where we truly can, it may sound cliche, but we can really make the world a better place. And I think that my hope for the future is that people will start to look at not only just their companies when it comes to hiring, but they will also, let me just back up and say that hiring is truly important. We need people from the C-suite all the way down to the entry-level positions. But I hope that our educators and our college and universities around the world will also look at internship opportunities and will connect with other businesses and colleagues they may not, know or even, talk to on a regular basis for opportunities for their students, and bringing in new opportunities for those, kids to be able to have opportunities that I did not have. I'll just say very, very briefly, I personally don't want anyone to go through what I did. I've gone through many situations where I went in for jobs, and I could instantly tell that because I am a female woman of color, instantly I saw their faces just change, and I knew I didn't get the job. And I know that may sound weird to some people to hear that, but it is very much true. And I have also been in rooms where people have said things basically to that point of why I wasn't going to be hired. And so I really do hope that, and I'm optimistic, but I'm very hopeful that everyone from our educators to our volunteers and organizations, the people who are leading these, nonprofits and Fortune 500 companies will just start to just look at themselves in the mirror and see that we are more alike than we are different. And truly, if we do come together, things really will prosper in a new and beautiful way. And, I also hope that we can bring more arts opportunities to underserved communities. I know for myself, I benefited from the arts. I went to a magnet art school growing up. And I know that it changed my life for the better. It's why I work in this in the music industry field. And so I hope that more kids will be able to have those opportunities too, and be able to think outside of whatever is surrounding them in their communities.
Wow. I'm just so thrilled by all of these beautiful thoughts and visions and manifestations for the future, and to be here to build with you all. In wrapping up, this is the end of our time together for now. In wrapping up, I would like to thank all of you. It's been such a pleasure. Really, really learned so much. You're so wise and brilliant and doing amazing work, and I commend all of you. My hopes for the future are that we can all have an abundance mindset, that there's enough for everybody, that power hoarding doesn't need to happen, that when the people who are the most vulnerable have the rights that everybody else has, then everyone thrives together in all sectors all over the world. And this is just the beginning of our conversations. I hope you all watching this enjoyed the conversation as well, and reach out to us and share what you all are doing and how we can continue to build together to create this true diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and bring out this world of abundance. So thank you so much.
Thank you. On behalf of the staff and board of Folk Alliance International, my sincere thanks, Karima, Valisha, Laura, Courtney, Allison. This session will continue to be available as a recording on the Folk Unlocked platform all week. So those of you who have joined us, if you'd like to share that with others who may not have been here, there are some really important and significant insights to share. So please do take a moment to provide feedback about today's conversation by posting comments in the chat. And finally, Folk Unlocked, this entire event, is made available at a pay-what-you-can price point to ensure access for anyone at this time, and also based on the generosity of our donors. So if you would like to support our work, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. Please do stay safe, stay connected, and stay a community. See you soon.